It was supposed to be perfect. The sun had come out after 2 straight weeks of gray skies. A soft breeze drifted through the Oregon vineyard, carrying the scent of ripened grapes and lavender. The ceremony had taken place beneath an arch of white roses and eucalyptus, the kind you see on Pinterest boards and luxury bridal magazines. Guests were sipping champagne, servers in black vests moved silently through the crowd, and somewhere under the tented reception space, my younger brother Ethan was laughing with his new wife. And yet, I had never felt more invisible. I was seated at the back of the reception tent, table 9, near the bar, tucked away from the family tables. The place cards were handwritten in gold ink, but my name looked like an afterthought, squished between 2 couples I barely remembered from childhood Thanksgivings. They were talking about real estate, kids, and upcoming ski trips. I sat there, fingers curled tightly around the stem of a half-empty glass of Merlot, pretending not to notice how little space I took up in the room. My eyes followed Ethan on the dance floor. He looked radiant, his black suit perfectly tailored, his grin stretching wide as he spun Madison, his bride, under the string lights. She laughed, hair flowing like a shampoo commercial. From the outside, they were the golden couple. Magazine material. I wanted to be happy for him, I really did. But beneath the surface, there was a weight in my chest, a whispering tension that had been growing for months. I'd seen the signs, the clipped tone when Madison spoke to me, the cold eyes behind polite smiles, the subtle digs that seemed harmless until you added them up. But I didn't expect this. I didn't expect her to walk up to me, uninvited, unprovoked, and pour acid into my wounds in front of everyone. "Olivia," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp, "you really shouldn't be here." I blinked, confused. "What?" She leaned in, but not close enough to be discreet. "People are starting to talk, wondering why you keep showing up in Ethan's life like some lost puppy. It's starting to look pathetic." The words slammed into me like a brick wall. Conversations around us quieted. The band's soft jazz faded into the background. I felt the stares before I even turned my head. People were watching, listening, pretending not to. Madison didn't stop there. "Ethan just couldn't say no to his little charity case of a sister," she said, swirling her wine. "But let's be honest. It's time you stepped aside. This is our life now, not yours." Her words didn't just sting, they humiliated. They shattered something inside me I didn't even know was still whole. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Nothing. Just a dry throat, a racing heart, and the overwhelming need to disappear. I stood up slowly. My legs felt shaky, my vision slightly blurred. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some curious, some pitying, some smug. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. I brushed the front of my navy blue dress, tucked a stray curl behind my ear, and walked toward the exit. The walk felt endless. Each step echoed in my head. My heels clicked against the polished floor, a lonely metronome counting down the seconds until I could breathe again. I passed familiar faces. Some offered weak smiles. Others looked away. No one said a word. Just as I reached for the door handle, a loud crash erupted behind me. A chair toppled. A gasp. Then silence. I turned. Ethan was standing, his fists clenched, his face red, not with embarrassment, but rage. Madison stared at him, stunned. Her wineglass dangled from her hand, untouched. But that confrontation, that explosion of truth, it would come later. Right now, I was frozen in the doorway, watching my entire world fracture under the weight of a single moment. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to where it all began. To the day everything changed. To the day I became more than a sister. I was 11 when the accident happened. Ethan was only 8. It was a Saturday night. Our parents had gone on a quick weekend getaway to Cannon Beach. They left us with an older neighbor, promised us they'd bring back taffy and postcards. I remember waving at their car as it disappeared down the street, not knowing it would be the last time I ever saw them. A drunk driver, a pileup, one of those tragedies you read about in the newspaper but never think will happen to you. By the time we were brought to the hospital, it was already over. The next few days were a blur: funeral arrangements, legal papers, suitcases packed in silence. No aunts or uncles stepped forward, no grandparents left to claim us. And so the state did. We became foster kids. Statistics, a file in the system. The homes we went to varied. Some were kind but temporary. Others were cold and transactional. Ethan cried a lot in the beginning. At night, when he thought I was asleep, I'd hear him sobbing into his pillow. So I made a decision. I wouldn't cry, not in front of him. If I stayed strong, he would stay afloat. That was the beginning of everything. The beginning of me becoming everything. When I turned 18, I had a choice. The state offered me a scholarship to community college, part of a special support program for kids aging out of foster care. But Ethan was 15, still in high school, still vulnerable. I turned it down. Instead, I worked. Mornings at a cafe, evenings at a law firm cleaning offices. I took on weekend shifts, skipped meals, slept on couches, and budgeted every penny. Ethan was brilliant. He got into the University of Washington. I cried when he read his acceptance letter. I cried harder when I saw the tuition. But I didn't let that stop me. I took out loans, maxed out credit cards, sold my laptop. I even picked up gig work. Event setup, bartending, floral delivery, anything that paid in cash. When Ethan graduated, I didn't attend the ceremony. I couldn't afford the train ride, but he sent me a photo, standing in his cap and gown, beaming. And the next week, I got a letter. Inside was a check for $2,500 and a note that read, "You gave me everything. Please let me give something back." I cried again. But I didn't spend the money. I saved it. Each check after that went into a special account. I wanted to return it someday, just in case he ever needed me again. With the little time I had, I started taking online classes, event planning, design, business management. I watched webinars while folding laundry, read textbooks during lunch breaks. Eventually, I built my own business, Maple and Stone Events. It wasn't glamorous at first, just backyard weddings and graduation parties. But it grew, slowly, then steadily, and then Madison entered the picture. When Ethan brought her home for dinner, I really tried to like her. She was beautiful, well-spoken, perfectly put together, the kind of woman who had a vision board and a 5-year plan. But her eyes never warmed. Her smile never softened. Her compliments always had edges. "You've done surprisingly well, considering your background." "It's impressive you run a business without a real degree." Still, Ethan was in love, so I smiled. I stayed quiet. I told myself it didn't matter. At their engagement dinner, her parents, Charles and Elaine Langford, were no better. "Rising from foster care? That's admirable," her mother said with a sip of her Chardonnay. "Grit is so in style these days," her father joked. Ethan gave me a look. I brushed it off. "I'm used to it," I told him later. "You shouldn't have to be," he said. I didn't respond, because deep down I was afraid he might one day agree with them. Betrayal? And now here I was, back in the present, standing at the edge of a room full of people who had watched my brother get married without understanding who had made it all possible. I had stayed silent for too long. But that was about to change. The chair clattered across the floor, the sharp wooden edge skidding slightly as it landed on its side. A gasp rose from somewhere near the dessert table. All eyes in the room, every single one, turned to the source of the sound. Ethan, my little brother, the groom, the golden boy, in a perfectly tailored black suit, was standing with both fists clenched and his jaw locked so tightly I could see the muscles twitch beneath his skin. He had slammed his chair back, hard, and now the entire vineyard had fallen silent. The soft jazz band had stopped mid-song. A server holding a tray of mini crème brûlée froze in place, eyes wide. One of the flower girls peeked out from under a tablecloth. Everyone, family, friends, business contacts, old college buddies, watched in complete stillness. Ethan's voice sliced through the silence. "Madison," he said, calm but shaking. "What the hell did you just say to my sister?" Madison, standing a few feet from me, stiffened. Her wine glass trembled in her manicured hand. She blinked quickly and gave a nervous little laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan, baby, it's nothing. Just a misunderstanding," she said lightly, as though we were on the patio discussing the flower arrangements. "I was just telling Olivia how grateful we are for her support all these years. That's all." The fakery in her voice dripped like spoiled honey. She didn't even bother to look at me. But Ethan wasn't buying it. His eyes narrowed. "You humiliated her," he said, his voice louder now. "In front of our entire family, our friends, my coworkers. Ethan, she's the reason I'm standing here today." His voice cracked as he jabbed a finger in my direction. "She raised me when we had no one. She gave up everything for me. And you just tried to push her out of my life like she's some embarrassment?" People began murmuring. Faces turned toward me with new expressions. Curiosity, guilt, some even shame. "I never—" Madison started, but Ethan cut her off. "Don't lie to me. You've been making snide comments for months. I heard what you said at your parents' dinner party. I kept pretending you didn't mean it. I kept hoping you'd grow out of it. But today, this?" He motioned toward the spot where I had stood just moments ago. "This is who you really are." Madison's cheeks flushed crimson. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for someone to rescue her. Then came the whispering voices. "Wait, she raised him? She paid for his school? Is that true?" And then Aunt Linda stood up. Aunt Linda had always been on the periphery of our lives, one of the few blood relatives who didn't abandon us completely, but also didn't exactly step up. Still, here she was now, dabbing the corner of her eye with a cloth napkin. "I was there," she said softly but firmly. "I saw what Olivia did. She didn't just take care of Ethan. She became a mother at 11 years old. While the rest of us looked away." Madison stiffened. Her grip on the wine glass faltered, and for a second I genuinely wondered if it would slip and shatter. Then another voice joined in, from behind the dessert table. "Tessa?" I blinked. Tessa Lorne, one of the only true friends I had from the foster system. We hadn't seen each other in years, but I'd recognized her earlier and exchanged a small wave. I didn't expect her to speak. "She was the only person who protected me," Tessa said, stepping into the light. "We were in the same group home for a while. Olivia made sure we ate, that we had clean clothes. One time, when my foster dad came home drunk and angry, she pulled me into her closet and locked the door from the inside until he passed out." The room gasped. Even Madison's mother, Elaine, clutched her pearls and exchanged a glance with her husband. I stood there, stunned. Tessa's voice was steady. "You want to talk about dignity? About class? Olivia's got more class in her little finger than some people have in their whole bloodline." Madison's face turned a deeper shade of red. She opened her mouth to say something, probably to defend herself, probably to twist things, but Ethan beat her to it. "You're not just my sister," he said, turning to me. His voice cracked again. "You're my hero." My throat tightened. "You've always been enough, Liv," he added, eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Gratitude, respect, love. And just as the tears started burning behind my eyes, another voice echoed from the back of the room. "Excuse me," a deep, clear voice called. "I believe we haven't been formally introduced." All heads turned again. A man in a perfectly tailored gray three-piece suit with silver hair and a calm, commanding presence stepped forward. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Madison whispered, barely audibly, "Dad, it's Mr. Whitaker." Her father paled. Daniel Whitaker. I didn't know the name then, but I could feel the room shift the moment he spoke. He walked with deliberate ease, pausing at the edge of the main floor. His voice carried, not because it was loud, but because it was composed, confident, measured. "My apologies for the delay," he said. "Traffic from the city is never predictable, but it seems I arrived just in time." He scanned the room, eyes landing briefly on Madison, then on me. "I was invited here today by Charles Langford," he continued. "He's been rather enthusiastic about forming a potential partnership with Marston & Cole. I thought a family event might offer insight into the values of a prospective partner." People exchanged looks. "And I must say—" He paused dramatically. What I've witnessed so far has been enlightening. Madison's father, Charles, tried to recover. Mr. Whitaker, please, this is just a misunderstanding, a personal issue. Whitaker raised one eyebrow. Oh, I'm sure it is. But when a woman is publicly humiliated and her brother rises to defend her with more integrity and loyalty than I've seen in most boardrooms, I take notice. He turned toward me. You must be Olivia Bennett. I nodded, barely able to speak. I've heard about your company, Maple and Stone Events, correct? A few of my staff have attended events you've planned. High marks, creative execution, efficient coordination. Thank you, I managed to say. Charles tried again. Well, she's from foster care. I'm not sure she represents the image. Whitaker turned his full gaze on him. So am I. The silence that followed was deafening. I was in the system until 16, Whitaker said, voice steady. Lived in group homes, shelters, couch-surfed my way through junior college, bought my first suit at Goodwill, and now I oversee a portfolio that includes 3 luxury hotel chains and a dozen commercial developments. He stepped forward, closer to me. We don't select partners based on where they started. We select them based on where they're going and who they lift on the way up. A pause. Then, and Olivia, I'd be proud to work with you. Oh. The entire room exhaled as if they had been holding their breath. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. I just nodded, grateful, humbled, and for the first time in a long time, truly seen. Ethan walked toward me, ignoring the scattered murmurs behind us. He reached out and pulled me into a hug. I should have done this sooner, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I leaned into him. It's okay, I whispered back. We're okay now. There are moments in life where everything slows down. The air thickens. The sound fades. Time itself holds its breath. This was one of those moments. Daniel Whitaker, regional director of Marston & Cole, one of the most prestigious firms in the Pacific Northwest, had just declared that he, like me, came from the foster system. And then, with all the grace and weight of a seasoned executive, he said he'd be proud to work with me. You could practically hear Madison's carefully crafted world begin to crack. Her father, Charles Langford, shifted uncomfortably. The color had drained from his face, his jaw tight as he scanned the room, no doubt calculating how to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it. Daniel Whitaker wasn't just a guest, he was the guest. The man who was supposed to be the Langford family's next big business win. And now, he had just publicly chosen me. I believe I've seen enough, Whitaker said, his tone polite but firm. This display has told me more about character and integrity than any pitch deck ever could. He nodded slightly in my direction and turned to leave. But before he could, Madison's voice rang out, tight and strained. Wait, Mr. Whitaker. He paused, but didn't turn around. I think you're misjudging the situation, she said, stepping forward with a trembling voice. There's more to the story. Olivia, she has a way of making herself look like the victim. Some. The silence that followed was suffocating. Whitaker turned his head slowly. You know, Ms. Langford, I've sat through enough board meetings and damage control sessions to know when someone is backpedaling. I'm not. You are. He faced her fully now, his voice sharp. And what's worse, you're not even good at it. Gasps fluttered through the room like wind through leaves. Madison froze, lips parted, words stuck somewhere between pride and panic. Ethan stepped up beside me, shoulders squared. We're done here, he said, his voice low but absolute. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because when you expose someone like Madison Langford, they don't crumble quietly. They unravel. At first, it was subtle. A twitch of the eye, a forced smile, her shoulders rigid but upright. Then came the lashing. So what? She snapped. She helped you as a kid. That doesn't mean she owns you, Ethan. My stomach dropped. She doesn't own me, he said through clenched teeth. She saved me. There's a difference. You're being emotional, Madison hissed. We have a life together, a plan. And you're going to throw it all away because your sister got her feelings hurt at a wedding? No, Ethan said, voice steady. I'm walking away because you showed me exactly who you are." Madison laughed bitterly. "This is ridiculous." She turned toward the crowd as if rallying a jury. "You all think this is noble? What Olivia did? She clung to him. She made herself indispensable. She was smart. I'll give her that. But everything she did was calculated. Don't be fooled." And I opened my mouth, ready to finally speak, but I didn't need to, because someone else stepped forward. "Actually," a new voice said, "you're the one who's been fooling people." It was Julia, Madison's own cousin. She stood tall, her expression unreadable, but her voice steady. I wasn't going to say anything. I wanted to keep the peace, but watching this, I can't stay quiet. Madison blinked. "Julia?" "You've been awful to Ethan from the beginning," Julia said. "You told me once you were only dating him to piss off your dad because he wouldn't let you go to Paris for that internship." "That's not true. You said, and I quote, 'He's sweet but kind of dull. At least he's stable.'" Madison's mouth opened, but no words came. Julia continued. "And you mocked Olivia constantly. You called her a walking Lifetime movie. Remember?" The room broke into murmurs. Ethan's face twisted in disbelief. "You said that?" he asked. Madison turned to him, reaching for his hand. "Ethan, He pulled his hand away like her touch burned. More voices joined in. "She called her that at the bridal fitting," said another woman, Claire, a bridesmaid. "She said Olivia was milking her tragic backstory. I thought she was joking." "I heard her complain that Olivia was low class and would ruin the photos," added Brandon, one of Ethan's co-workers. The floodgates had opened. And Madison? She stood there drowning. I should have felt satisfied, vindicated, but all I felt was sad. Sad that Ethan had loved her. Sad that she could have had something real and threw it away. Sad that no one stopped her until now. Madison looked around the room, her mascara smudged, her cheeks flushed, her grip on her wine glass finally loosening. "You're all against me," she whispered. "This is a witch hunt." "No," I said quietly, stepping forward for the first time. "It's a reckoning." She stared at me, hatred flickering behind her eyes. "You planned this, didn't you?" I shook my head. "I didn't need to. You did this all by yourself." Elaine Langford stood up next, her face pale but composed. "Madison," she said softly, "we need to go. But now." Charles followed, silent and rigid. Together they walked out, escorted not by security, but by the crushing weight of their own disgrace. Ethan stood next to me, still catching his breath. "You okay?" I asked, placing a hand on his arm. He turned to me, eyes glassy. "Not really, but I'm glad it happened." "Me too." He looked at the exit one last time and exhaled. "I was about to marry someone who hated the most important person in my life." I swallowed hard. "I didn't want to ruin your day." He smiled softly. "You didn't. You saved it." As the guests slowly began to gather their coats, someone turned up the music again. The string lights still glowed overhead. It wasn't the celebration we had planned, but somehow, it was better. It was honest. It was real. The Langfords were gone. The heels of Madison's mother clacked harshly against the stone walkway as she stormed out of the vineyard, dragging her husband behind her. And Madison, still in her designer wedding gown, makeup smeared and chest heaving, followed, refusing to look back. For a moment, the reception stood still, suspended in disbelief. The tent lights flickered gently above us, casting soft golden hues over stunned faces. The jazz band had stopped playing long ago. The celebration was over, but the truth had only just begun. I stood next to Ethan, still numb from everything that had unfolded. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, but all I felt was this strange cocktail of relief and heartbreak. Then I heard the first slow clap. It started with Julia, Madison's cousin, still standing tall in her crimson bridesmaid dress, eyes burning with clarity, and then another, from Claire, the bridesmaid who had once smiled politely at Madison's cruelty. Then from Brandon, the coworker who'd watched Ethan's engagement unravel like a dropped string of pearls. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, for me. Not because I won, but because I finally stood up. "Liv," Ethan said, turning to me. His voice was rough with emotion, his eyes shining. I don't even know how to explain what I'm feeling right now." "You don't have to," I said gently. "Just breathe." We sat down at the edge of the patio side by side. It was the same bench we'd used when we toured the vineyard months earlier, scouting the venue for his big day. Back then, Madison was laughing about tablecloth colors and imported champagne. Now, she was probably calling her lawyer. Ethan exhaled hard. "She fooled me." "No," I corrected him. "You saw what you wanted to see, and that's not foolish. That's hopeful. That's love." He was quiet for a long beat. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he asked. "That time we were kids, and it rained through the roof of that crappy foster house. You found a bucket, wrapped us in a blanket, and told me it was a pirate ship." I laughed softly. "We were escaping a sea monster." He smiled. "You always made the storm feel smaller." We sat there as the night cooled around us. And then the guests started coming. It started with Tessa. She knelt in front of me, hands folded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've never said thank you," she whispered. "Not properly. You saved me. You didn't have to, but you did. You were just a kid, too." I squeezed her hand. "You would have done the same for me." Then Julia approached. "I'm sorry it took me this long to say something. I should have spoken up sooner." "You did," I said. "When it mattered." Brandon chimed in next. "You know, at the company, people always joke that Ethan was too good for Madison. Turns out he was." Ethan smirked. "Gee, thanks." More people followed, guests who had watched in silence, some ashamed, others inspired. They offered apologies, support, stories of their own, moments where they had been quiet when they should have spoken, complicit when they should have resisted. But they weren't quiet anymore, and neither was I. Just when I thought the surprises were over, someone else stepped forward. A tall woman in her late 40s, wearing a navy blue blazer and carrying a small notebook. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Are you Olivia Bennett?" I nodded. "Yes," she smiled. "I'm Angela Monroe. I run Elevate Northwest, a nonprofit supporting young women aging out of foster care. Daniel Whitaker told me about you last week. He said you might be someone we'd want to connect with." My eyebrows lifted. "He mentioned me?" "He didn't just mention you," she said. "He said your story needed to be heard, that your business wasn't just successful, it was built on heart, on resilience." Ethan nudged me. "Told you you're a badass." Angela handed me her card. "We're hosting a mentorship summit next month in Seattle. We'd love for you to be a speaker, and maybe a partner?" I took the card, heart pounding. I'd be honored. Later that night, as the vineyard emptied and the stars bloomed over the hills, Ethan and I wandered into the empty ceremony space. The altar still stood, draped in sheer ivory fabric. The chairs were half full. Some of the flowers had begun to wilt. "I still can't believe it," he murmured. "I almost married someone who thought less of the person who made me who I am." "You didn't," I said simply. He nodded. "Because you didn't let me." We stood in silence, bathed in moonlight. "I think I need to find out who I am outside of all this," Ethan said. "Outside of Madison, of being the guy who got saved." "You're not just someone I saved," I replied. "You're someone who grew, who gave back, who stood up." He looked at me with soft eyes. "You really believe that?" "I do." He exhaled. "Then maybe it's time to start over." The next morning, we had breakfast together at a tiny diner on the edge of the city. No suits, no tuxes. Just two siblings, sipping burnt coffee and splitting pancakes like we used to when we were broke, and everything tasted better because it was ours. Ethan opened his laptop and showed me a logo concept. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've built this incredible company, but maybe it's time for phase 2. I raised an eyebrow. "You want in?" He nodded. "As a partner, officially." "Even after all this?" "Especially after all this," I laughed. "You really think people want a co-founder who walked out on his wedding?" He grinned. "I think they'll love the guy who stood up for what mattered." I looked at the screen again. New logo, same name, Maple and Stone Events. Only this time, it was ours. Back at my apartment later that day, I opened my closet and pulled out the shoebox where I kept Ethan's first $1,500 check. I had never spent it. I'd never even deposited it. I looked down at it now, the handwriting a little faded, the sticky note still attached. "You gave me everything. Please let me give something back." I smiled, then slid it into a new envelope. Wrote, "For our first client meeting" on the front, and tucked it into my briefcase. Because this wasn't just about repayment. It was about beginning again. This time, on my terms. 3 months. That's how long it had been since the wedding that never happened. Since the night Ethan walked away from the altar and into the truth. Since the night Madison Langford's world collapsed, publicly, irreversibly. And mine somehow began. In those 3 months, life shifted in ways I never could have imagined. The headlines weren't gentle. Billionaire groom walks out after bride humiliates sister. The sister behind the wedding, fallout speaks out through her business. But I stayed quiet. I didn't give interviews. I didn't gloat. Instead, I worked, harder than ever. Maple and Stone Events exploded overnight. After Daniel Whitaker publicly backed me at the wedding, our inbox flooded with inquiries. Companies wanted brand launches, nonprofits wanted gala planners, and small business owners wanted someone who understood resilience. We hired 3 new assistants, 2 interns, leased a new office in downtown Portland with high ceilings and massive windows. Ethan officially came on board as co-founder. We sat side by side, just like we used to at our tiny fold-out kitchen table when we were teenagers sharing ramen. Only now, it was strategy meetings, client pitches, logistics spreadsheets, and designer coffee. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" Ethan asked one morning, sipping from his black ceramic mug, laptop glowing in front of him. "Not even in my most dramatic daydreams," I said. He smirked. "Not even after I gave you that first $1,500? I rolled my eyes. "That check is in my drawer. Don't act like you gave me a car." "You're welcome for your empire." I laughed, but deep down, he wasn't wrong. That check was never about the money. It was about recognition, about finally being seen. The summit Angela Monroe invited me to was held in Seattle in a glass-walled ballroom overlooking the bay. Hundreds of people attended: social workers, mentors, former foster youth, business leaders, journalists. I was the closing keynote speaker. I stood in front of the mic, palms slightly damp, heart racing, looking out at rows of young women who reminded me of myself at 16, hungry for guidance, unsure if their story had any worth. And then I told them the truth, about growing up in the system, about rainy nights, broken furniture, and how I used to read Ethan bedtime stories from a torn copy of Charlotte's Web because it was the only book we had, about giving up college so he could go, about saving every penny, about building something from nothing, about getting insulted at a wedding, and how sometimes the ugliest endings become your best beginnings. I didn't sugarcoat it. And when I finished, they stood, all of them, clapping, some crying. Angela met me off stage, tears in her eyes. "You just changed lives," she whispered. But I shook my head. "No, I just reminded them they still have the power to write their own." Later that night, I found myself back in Portland, walking through my neighborhood in the quiet dark. The city buzzed faintly, distant traffic, a siren blocks away, the soft hum of summer. Ethan was on the phone with a client, so I stopped by our office alone. It was late. No lights on except the soft glow from the security system. I stood in the doorway and took it in, the vision boards, the cork wall full of Polaroids from weddings we'd planned, the sticky notes Ethan still left on my desk when I worked too late. "Eat something, or I'll send a taco drone. Don't forget, you're a badass." I walked over to my drawer, opened it, and pulled out that old envelope. The check, still folded neatly. The sticky note still intact. "You gave me everything," Please let me give something back. This time, I smiled. Then I grabbed a pen and wrote under his message. You already did. Now let's keep building. A week later, I found myself sitting in an outdoor cafe in Eugene, meeting with a new bride-to-be named Naomi. She was sweet, kind, a bit anxious. I want the wedding to feel like home, she said. But my mom keeps pushing this country club thing. I don't want chandeliers. I want string lights and fire pits and homemade pie. I grinned. Sounds like my kind of night. She relaxed a little. It's just hard, trying to make everyone happy. I nodded slowly. Can I tell you a secret? She leaned in. Your wedding? It's not supposed to please everyone. It's supposed to reflect you. And when you finally walk down that aisle, the only people who matter are the ones who celebrate you for who you are, not who they want you to be. Naomi blinked back tears. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that. Actually, I did, because I once needed to hear it too. Joel. On the drive back to Portland, Ethan called. Guess what? He said. What? Mr. Whitaker just referred us to a luxury resort chain. They want to partner with us for all their West Coast events. My mouth dropped. Are you serious? Dead serious. And get this, he mentioned possibly investing. I nearly swerved into the breakdown lane. No way. Oh, and one more thing, Ethan added. The Langfords lost their big investor last month. Word got out about the wedding incident. I paused, then said, without bitterness, That's karma. Let it do what it does. He chuckled. You're growing soft. No, I'm just done carrying anger. Proud of you, Liv. I smiled into the wind. Proud of us. That weekend, we celebrated. Nothing fancy, just me, Ethan, Tessa, Julia, and a few close friends. We grilled on the back porch, played card games, and told stories that made us laugh until we cried. At one point, Ethan raised a toast. To family, he said, not the one you're born into, the one you build. We clinked glasses, and for the first time in years, I felt like everything was exactly where it should be. In the months that followed, we kept growing. More events, more team members, more chances to make a difference. But we never forgot where we came from, because that was our power. Our story wasn't about revenge. It was about resilience, about rising, not to destroy others, but to build something better. And as I stood backstage at yet another conference months later, waiting to share my journey once more, I looked at my reflection in the mirror and whispered, "You did it," then smiled and stepped into the light.